Welcome to the Lovecraft Country Discussion Group video podcast. This is our fourth installment, episode 7. We have our illustrious hosts, tailor-made, moderators and contributors, China, Omira, Yeli, and Pamela Wood. I am your announcer, Justin Davis, and moderator. Welcome to the show.
Okay, episode 7. We have Hip's episode and a lot of excellent stuff. This was everyone's energy episode, right?
Absolutely. Oh my God. Chomping at the bit.
Okay, let's see. Let's get into, these are some heavy, again, we're gonna do our key talking points. Let's get into the guiding of Black women. Aspects of sexuality, love, war, how our anger is for purpose. Let's get into that. Okay. So we start off, a few things have happened. We're going to skip right over Christina and Ruby and everything that was happening in the basement. And we are on this road trip with Hip. She's in Woody. She's headed to Mayfield, and she has Josephine Baker on the radio. She's listening to Piel Canela, which means cinnamon skin, came out in 1953. And interestingly enough, I had to look this up because it was so repetitive, I wanted to know what was going on. And the lyrics translated to black eyes, cinnamon skin that drive me to desperation. It was originally written by a man, so Josephine covered this. And then it goes into repeating, I care about you and you and you and only you. So this theme song is what Hip is driving down the street listening to when she sees Bessie Springfield ride by on her motorcycle. And it's important to note that she is sort of a benchmark for, forerunners and pioneer women, African-American women. She was the first one to ride by herself across the U.S., visiting all 48 contiguous states, meaning everyone except for Alaska and Hawaii. She worked for the U.S. Army as a civilian dispatch rider during World War II. So this was the send-off for Hip and her journey. And I thought it was interesting to note that, she may have felt alone, but she wasn't alone. She was with someone else that was like a forerunner and a pioneer that became famous for making this journey by herself. And, I thought that was a really nice way to send off Hip. China, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I love that we see this theme of the sirens come up yet again. And Josephine Baker is very much our episode siren. Throughout this episode, with not only her dance and her movement, but her singing as well as her allure that kind of draws people in. And so I found it fascinating that she was also the first Black woman in a major motion picture film, which happened to be called Siren of the Tropics. The writers are just beyond. And so the foreshadowing of Josephine singing as Hip is driving and her completely mesmerizing song in that scene with Montrose and Sammy, when Sammy says, cut that record on, that's Josephine as well. I just thought it was a beautiful touch and foretelling of Hip's journey to come.
Mm-hmm. Amira?
So I took it as like she's going through a journey that addresses like her aspect of who she is, and then she's internalizing everything that's happening and what has happened. Another thing that I really liked was, when she was leaving the job, she was going over what was happening with Dee, and she was saying that you can see Dee is just like in distress, like she doesn't know how to feel emotionally. And she kind of like lightens up when she sees the Dorothea comic book in her lunch tray. So it goes to show, like, even though in anger, the simplicity of things that we can do for another can like change your mood. But you also see her just go through this aspect of like analyzing herself and where she is and where she wants to be.
Mm-hmm. So from this, we go into like a major theme in this episode, which is the shrinking of Black women in society, not living up to our full potential because of either wifely responsibilities, mothering, careers, family pressure, time limitations, you know, and how do we maintain and fight to preserve a sense of self in the midst of all of that? China.
So this whole episode in terms of shrinking was just really huge for me. And so in this episode, we see this shrinking happening in a few different instances. So Leti in particular has been, you know, shrinking herself, I want to say, since she and Tick's first sexual interaction. And so one person in the group noticed that Leti stopped wearing her brighter, more vibrant colors and opted for more of like a bland color scheme with her clothing and with her makeup. And some I saw were like attributing this to, oh, she's in a relationship. Like many women dress more conservatively in those instances, which is true. But I thought this was also a great way for the wardrobe on this show to indicate a shift in demeanor and behavior as well. And so things like Leti not mentioning her pregnancy to Tick conveniently because, you know, well, he has so much on his mind, you know, decoding, translating, trying to keep us all from dying, pretty much. So let me just minimize this part of the dream. You know, it's just a dream anyway. You know, all these little things that go through our head, and she didn't even have to say it. It's just one of those things where it's like, it's best if I leave this out. And again, when Tick found out about Montrose, you know, Leti just calmly approaches him, tries to divert his anger, you know, tries to calm him. And again, she's seen this explosive side of him too. So, and you know, I noticed it again when they're outside of Hip's place and Leti didn't want to say that she actually wanted to stay with Ruby until Tick was the one who brought it up and suggested it. And so when we come across Hip first beginning to open up and she's on that stage in Paris and she's reveling in her femininity. And, you know, this is when it was clear to me that that experience was signifying, okay, you're a mother, you're a wife, you're a friend, you're a daughter, et cetera, but you're also a whole woman before any of that. So I so loved seeing Hip just explore her body, really getting into it, her sexuality, her freeness, and just getting in touch with, you know, her divine feminine.
Ellie, what do you think about the shrinking? Oh, mute.
Sorry. I really enjoyed the conversation we had in the discussion group on Facebook. Y'all know I had a million comments in there. One thing I think is important to kind of talk about is, and this is skipping kind of ahead toward the end, but the way in which Hip and George talk about this shrinkage, right? The way they talk about the shrinking process and that he assisted her, he allowed it and encouraged it so that he could live his life, right? And reach his own goals and aspirations. You know, what's interesting about that conversation is that he knew she had this discoverer inside of her. He knew it all along. This is not like revelatory. You know, this is what attracted him to her in the first place. And yet he allowed that discoverer to be diminished and chipped away at slowly over the years in service of his goals, right? And I don't know about everyone else, but that definitely is something I've experienced in my life. And so Hip actually throughout her journeys in this episode kind of also blames herself. So it's not just blaming George, right? But it's blaming herself for participating in her own shrinking, right? And this is something I was thinking about, how Black girls and perhaps all girls are raised in these patriarchal societies, and particularly in the Western world, and maybe even from the previous episode in the East. We're raised to be these self-pruning flowers. You know, we grow. If we're in the wild, who knows what we would look like. But you know, within the confines of our societies, the Akan have this proverb: the husband is the wife is the flower, the husband is the fence around it, right? Which, you know, for a long time I thought was like such a romantic concept and a romantic way of looking at marriage, as your husband protects you, right? And then you get to be beautiful. But you got thorns, you know what I mean? If you're a rose, like imagine if you're a rose in there, you don't need the fence, because you're not just gonna get plucked by any old animal. You've got your own defense mechanisms and you've got your own strengths. And we're taught to kind of pare ourselves down to something that is non-threatening and is will fit neatly within the fence, you know? And so she's mad at herself for participating in her own shrinking, like this self-pruning flower that many of us are raised to, kind of like ways to keep ourselves within these social norms, these gender norms. Another point I thought about related to this shrinking concept is her relationship to Dee, right? And this is something China's brought up, Omira's brought up. This pressure that we have as mothers to shrink in order to be mothers. Like somehow those two must go together, but I don't think they are. And I think Dee is discovering that they don't go together. You don't have to be small or stay put to be a mother. You know, I always tell myself, like, babies are mobile. I strapped my daughter on my back, wrapped her up, and we was out. You know, we hit the road. You know, that's my roadie. You know, and I think that's really important, because Dee doesn't want a small mother. She doesn't want a shrunken mother. She imagines her mother as this superhero. Her mother is Orinthia Blue. We literally see Dee in the first scene where we see Dee. She's sketching Orinthia Blue based on a photograph of her mother, right? So she's imagining, and she can see the greatness in her mother even when her mother can't see her own greatness. I know for me, my daughter sees that in me all the time, and I'm like, who is this lady? You know, she's like, you. And so I have to be great for her. You know, I have to be my biggest, most expansive self for her. So I think there's a lot about mirroring and mirror work in this episode. Some people would call that shadow work. I think this brother in the Facebook group brought up a really interesting point about shadow work, where those who we love can sometimes hold up that mirror so we can see ourselves more clearly. And that's what Dee's been trying to do this whole time for everybody. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like that about the thorns too. You know,
Absolutely.
yeah, I like that.
I love that, because it also introduces the concept of that we keep seeing throughout the series of how much is it protecting until you cross over into stifling, or you know, it's like when you, what's that saying, when you love a flower, or when you like a flower, you pick it, and when you love a flower, you water it.
That's right.
Exactly.
It's similar to that. I love that.
Mm-hmm. And also, I wanted to mention, and this group can attest to it, I went so nerdy in this direction because I was so excited to see this side of Hip. But I thought it was important to note the shrinkage that she was imposing on herself for her actual brain, just for her actual sheer brilliance and capacity of thought. Like, that was what attracted me to her character in particular. And we see it when the officers show up and they ask her, like, well, how'd you get this machine to work? And she shrinks herself and goes, I'm just a traveler that got lost. And they're like, no, you're not. So they didn't let her shrink herself. They knew enough to know it's on. This is complicated. We don't understand it. People have died for this thing. And yet you're sitting here just, how did you get this to work? And so I wanted to sort of explore some of the things that were going on here with her, because I like that they put this in the storyline. These are actual fields of study. These are people, these are theorists and physics scientists and people that study these things. So I stumbled on the CERN.
Wait, before you go there, I wanted to just put a note in there that just occurred to me. Someone else brought up a very important point about shrinkage as survival.
Yes.
You know, telling the cops that she was just a anybody was really a form of survival in that particular moment. And, you know, that's definitely a long tradition with our ancestors, kind of shrinking themselves so massa won't know how brilliant we are and what we're up to, and trying to get away, right? And trying to seem less intelligent and less capable because liberation's on the other side of that capability, right? So, but yeah, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. I'm glad you said that. Because what they weren't aware of is she was sitting here doing all these calculations and everything, and I wanted to know, what would this machine have to be? Like, what would this have to be in order for her to get involved in interdimensional travel? And essentially, there was an organization founded in 1951 called CERN. And it stands for, well, in English, it's the European Council for Nuclear Research. In French, the acronym makes better sense because all those words are moved around and it spells CERN. So they are actually involved in the study surrounding particle physics. And they use some of the most intricate scientific instruments and technology to do so. The machine that HIP was interfacing with, though it's a product of science fiction, it would have had to be an amalgamation of actual instruments. So it wouldn't have quite looked like that. So cinematically, it wouldn't have worked. But essentially what she was working with was something like a particle accelerator, which they have one underground in Sweden where they shoot particles at ungodly speeds at each other and track how they explode and interact with each other. It would have to be something that interrupts electromagnetic force fields, and something that also potentially splits and regenerates atoms. All of that would have to be happening to open a portal like that and to let her actually be able to transport her physical form into another dimension. I definitely oversimplified that because it's not like we're just teleporting everywhere, but those are some of the things that were involved in like her studies, and she connected that to astronomy. And I just thought, side note, there's a quirky little thing in history called the Philadelphia experiment. And it's where a naval ship was disappeared. And they believe that they messed with the particles around it. The ship disappeared, it just left a green fog. And when it reappeared, many of the sailors on it died, and some of them were actually fused into the ship. This happened, the testing began in 1943 in a Philly naval shipyard. So little things like that, like people have been messing with it, and it's a very real thing. It has actual theories around it. And just seeing her, able to figure out how to get the key, how to get this to come on. It was just a beautiful like reflection of how big she really had been shrinking herself down into, so that's my little blurty segment on that.
Well, you know what? It doesn't take all day to recognize sunshine. That's why the cops immediately said, "What are you doing here?" Yeah. That happens to I want to say most people of color. Who are you? So I'm reflecting on what you're saying, that people see exactly who you are without you identifying, no matter how much you shrink. And I just want to say really quickly about what I saw in our group about women's reactions to the shrinkage part. Inside of our group, we began to see stories about, where do I go with this information? I can't even stay in this bedroom with my husband right now. I need to go somewhere and contemplate, what does shrinkage mean for me? There were folks that were going to their laundry rooms and standing and thinking alone about, what does it mean to shrink? So this was huge. We're aware of it, and I'm sure the discussion will continue in the group. I just want to say that we definitely recognized and felt what you all were feeling.
Another great thing that happened was, now I don't know if you saw this, Pamela, there were some husbands in the group.
Yes.
Who had asked their wives, like, have I shrunk you? Have I helped you shrink?
Yes.
It was amazing.
There was some therapy conversations after episode 7, and I don't think a lot of folks were expecting these things to be happening in their homes right now. So you can see the shock in what they wrote, and the fact that there were men saying, "Did I shrink you?" And the answers were, I guess, mostly no. I don't know what the results were, but I'm interested in it, definitely.
I'm here for all of that. These conversations need to happen. I mean, it's powerful that a husband would raise the question, that a spouse would raise the question to another spouse, a partner would raise the question to another partner. Have I helped you minimize yourself? Are you free in this relationship, right? oh, that's so necessary. I'm grateful for just that. If nothing else of value comes from this episode, like that's everything. That's super.
Exactly.
That's, yeah.
I think a powerful piece for me was when they talked about the anger and the balance of being angry and being empathetic at the same time. And I think a lot of the times as women, we always, especially Black women, always get characterized as being angry. And I know personally for me, I've never looked at it as being angry. I looked at it as being resolute in how you feel and like being able to like compress all the emotions that's processing through you. And I think the way they did it was just like really great kind of like undertone to it, where it's kind of like while you're shrinking, you're going to get upset because you're going to realize that in this process, you've been limiting yourself and you've been limited by the interpretation of others. And I think, you know, even in the aspect of like work and your family, you're doing it in a way where it's kind of like it's happening. And it makes you think like, is this happening? It made me think, is this happening because it's happening, or is it happening because I'm allowing it to happen? And you get that sense of like taking ownership of yourself. And, you know I've mentioned this before in regards to like establishing those boundaries in regards to like what your expectations are and what you think to do. Because a lot of the times people do to you what you allow them to do. And that was just my interpretation from that piece.
And you also had a note about William and Christina.
So I noticed that when Ruby's talking to Christina references like, hey, she kind of plays into like, I understand where you're coming from because I'm a woman and I've been repressed, not even by someone that I was, that like a significant other, but my father. My father suppressed me in the way of like, I couldn't join Adam. I couldn't be powerful. When I had to consult and get she said it that she like played on William in a way, and she highlighted that he was her lover. So he actually puts her in a platform to kind of like grow and develop her own magic. And to me, for her to be a woman, she's more magical than a lot of the other people around. She has more magic than Lancaster. In some capacity, she had more magic than her father. She was able to like cross-sector all these things, and because she saw the unlimitless potential of herself, and she defined it for herself. And a lot of the times when you do that, you get seen as being angry, or you get seen as being evil, or you get seen as being, we view her as like the pessimist of the story. But the reality is, in my perspective, is like she's relative. Like, is she the villain, or is she just someone that's addressing the uncertainties that were handed to her? Because we're all in the aspect of looking for power, and power is established through different ways. So that was my interpretation of that. Like, it played a key role, but we do know that William was her lover and he was killed by Lancaster. So it's a personal vengeance. It's a personal vendetta. And you see that anger and love come in where it's like, I'm gonna get him. And this is deeper than what's happening within this situation. This is about you're killing the person that developed me and motivated me, and you're killing the love of my life in a way, because your insecurity and your fear.
Mm-hmm. So in between these two big chunks, there's like a little sliver where Tick goes to visit and he's learning about Aunt Ethel and this and this. And there was a hint of a love affair. Pam, just speak on this briefly. And then we're going to move on.
So literally in the podcast, we learned today as a group that scene where Oberta, or Bertie, as she's called by her bestie, Ethel, that they had a love affair following the death of both their husbands. But at the dinner table, we certainly didn't ascertain that this is what Bertie was trying to put over to Tick in this conversation. She simply says, Ethel said to her, you know what, for us two old ladies, what is there for us to do? And so I found that this theme of women communing together beyond just having men around them, taking it to different levels and different spaces that certainly are unexpected. We see it in Paris because, it's joie de vivre, c'est la vie, c'est la guerre. We should be out doing whatever we need to do if we're in Paris. But if we're in little, St. Louis, should we really be who we could possibly aspire to be if we asked ourselves, even at 65 or 70. I'm guessing at Birdie's age, but I thought that was interesting.
Okay, so now we get to a topic that was a little controversial and bizarre, and it was the notion of Leti being pregnant. I'm just going to throw all these words out there. It was Leti being an undead, dead vampire who can't handle smelling garlic, and she's pregnant. It was all of that. What do we think about this? Because that's a lot. That's a lot even for this.
It's possible. Because when Ruby was cooking the food and she smelled the garlic, is it because she's pregnant, or is it because it relates to a vampire who, they don't like garlic or allergic to it, if you will? And when she leaves the room, excusing herself to compose herself, if you look, she goes past a mirror, and the image in the mirror looked to be a bit faded, which also goes back to vampires. You don't see the reflection, possibly relating to them being undead. And remember, she was shot, killed, and brought back to life. So is she undead? Are there some vampire-like qualities, or does it just have to do with her being pregnant? The writers could be toying with the issue and throwing it out there, and maybe there's something there, maybe there's not.
Yeah, that was thrown out there. I'll say that. That was good.
I noticed a theme with mirrors too. I like that, Justin, you mentioned vampires have this thing with mirrors where they can't see their own reflections. And so the whole idea that mirrors are windows to the soul, and the similarities that I even see with Gia, and Gia looks in the mirror and her eyes are kind of dead, and we already know that she's a spirit. The soul of the real Gia is not there. So I see these similarities between the two, but it's just interesting that the writers chose to allude so strongly to Leti being pregnant throughout the entire episode. So in the dream, she's pregnant. She wakes up, she feels her stomach. She doesn't tell Tick. She's somewhat nauseous at smelling the garlic. And then Ruby says again, "Oh, you may be pregnant." And so it seems almost too in your face for the writers of this show to just be alluding to her being pregnant. So I think it's also worth mentioning that it's a good possibility that there is this paranormal and otherworldly aspect to the situation with Leti. And so it does introduce the idea of Leti being in touch with the other side, seeing Hannah, Leti possibly being pregnant with the next heir, and what a child with Tick as a possibly essentially undead person would even really look like, if that's possible, or what's going on there.
And remember, in the house, she was able to summon the spirits to help her to get rid of Hiram. So she may have some sort of connection with the undead.
Okay, so we jump back to the observatory, and Tick shows up right in the nick of time. There's a scuffle. The portal's open. We see scenes are flashing. They throw one cop in, but not the other. We're going to gloss over that. And we see Hip get sucked into the portal, and she's carried to a seemingly vacant planet that's just run by androids, and there's like a spaceship entity. Interdimensional travel, China. What are we getting into?
So all of this interdimensional travel and parallel timelines and different dimensions is right up my alley. So I'm by far not an expert in any way. I'm just a lover of everything sci-fi and fantasy. And so when I looked at the coordinates that kept popping up, I noticed that the same coordinates on the orrery, on the time machine, and when Hip is transported to that new planet are all the same. So in logic, Hip is actually in the exact same spot, but that third coordinate when she's transported seemed to be a time coordinate rather than a location like latitude and longitude. And so I'm interested to see what the people in the group who have an expertise in this think, because that may just be something I'm completely making up. But this is what led me to believe that Hip is actually on Earth, but a different dimension completely. And so this also explains why, for example, when Hip is with the kingdom of Dahomey, the third coordinates change as she's training, but the first two remain the same, you know, indicating that she's in the same spot, but time is moving differently. So the observatory that Hip goes to on Earth, the Mayfield Observatory, is actually the spaceship or base that she sees when she's first transported. It's just in a completely different dimension where the planet looks, you know, completely different. So,
and you know what? I'm excited about this because this is opening up our platform. Like, we are no longer just from 1954 to 1943. You know, like, now we can explore what were all these visions that Gia was seeing? What was all that on Tick's timeline? Like, was some of that the suffering, him potentially dying, some other woman in the bed, like, all of this could have existed in literally any dimension on any kind of timeline. It probably, which also means George could be alive on a timeline, like in a certain dimension, as he's seen with Hip in this episode. So in a reality, in one of these parallel universes, we still have George. He might have written a book. It might have been Lovecraft country, as bizarre as all that is, you know, but like the possibility of that to be able to happen now that we are in a multiverse is just phenomenal. And for those that don't know, because I know there are a few people that are like, what? All of the nerds woke up on this episode. I'm just going to say that. And we like went rampant through the whole group. And there were so many people that were like, what is multiverse? And we just ran in and yelled multiverse and screamed. And they were like, what's happening? And so essentially, a multiverse is the idea that there are infinite many universes. There are infinite many possibilities, timelines, alternate realities. Deja vu is in there. Why is that? Am I the only one that there is? How many of me are there? How many Earths are there? How many realities are there? It's all of that is included in the idea of a multiverse. So the minute Hip went through the wall, all bets have been off. We don't know what could happen. And they could literally, they have free reign to throw anything they want at us from this point out. That's what that means.
And you know, some sci-fi people may be familiar with the Mandela effect. I don't know if anybody here is, but it's the idea that some people remember Mandela having passed in jail in like the 80s, when in actuality, and like legit religiously believe that because they saw it in a newspaper and it was all over the news and they have vivid memories of this. And then there's a whole other group of thousands of people who know what we know now is he actually got out of jail and he died, you know, in his home. And so little things like the Berenstain Bears used to be the Berenstain Bears with an A. And, you know, Fruit Loops, is it Loops or is it, you know, it's, or no, is it Froot or is it spelled fruit like we know it? There's just these little things. And so some people attribute it to jumping timelines. Like say, you know, 2012 when the Mayan calendar was set to end and everybody was like, oh my God, the world is ending. That could be where some people hopped a different timeline and now the people who remember the previous one are remembering it differently. And it's just, it's a lot, but I know some people in the group will know, you know, the Mandela effect. And so that ties in here as well. The idea of parallel universes and alternate timelines. It's fun.
Amira, do you want to talk really quickly about what else might have happened on this timeline?
So my interpretation was that Tick went through the universes, even though it's not shown, but I think of the information provided from Ethel through his friends, through his cousin's partner. Tick may have gone back into the time frame of 1921, which is during the time frame of the Tulsa massacres, and that's where she references, that book, or that she thought it was a photograph book. She said that book burned. baby. I remember her saying that to him. And I think from that, I think the book was passed down to George from Dora. I think Dora really kind of gave George that prerequisites of what was really happening, which is why in some ways he kind of shrunk himself in things that he knew in regards to being able to share that. I think the book that Tick went to actually get, the Lovecraft Country, is actually the Book of Names. I think they changed the format of the book to fit that so that it could be hidden in plain view, where you're not looking for this antique looking book, rather than it's the book that's sitting there in your face. And it makes me question the aspect of the family lineages in regards to, like, you see the reference of the birthmark, and you see the Ethel have the same birthmark as Tick, as well as it links to the powers that they may possess. And then the multi-universe question is that the aspect of death and being able to live within another universe, not being impacted by what's happening with others. That was something that came to mind for me.
Cool. So we finally make it on the ship, and we see this absolute goddess and her fro in all its glory. And that was just everything I needed to know personally. That's all I needed to know about it. Before she said anything else, I felt like everything was going to be okay and that we were going to have an understanding. That was just me. But Eli, talk to us about what was going on with Hip and what we're seeing with Hip on this ship.
Yeah, it just, I just want to just echo what you just said. You just got to take a moment out for, like, Black Lady God. I have just, in my head, I call her God, G-A-W-D, God, there are a lot of different references for who this Beyoncé being is, but I'm with you. Like, I was like, oh, okay. I don't need to see anything else. This is enough. This is enough. It made me think of all the t-shirts that say, I met God, she's Black. That was a popular t-shirt a couple years ago. And I'm just like, yes, the future is Black and female, right? Like, this is the summation of all of that sentiment. And Hip is in this interesting process of rebirth, right? Because she is actually naked when she's first in this ship, or in this machine on this new world, or this other world. And so I kind of noticed this idea of nakedness that kind of appears in the episode. So Hip is naked. Before that, way earlier, Montrose is also at least half naked when he's standing in the hallway. And so this kind of question of being laid bare, like who you really are inside, is being kind of put forth and laid bare in front of everyone, particularly in front of you, right? So Montrose, on one hand, he's still fighting that, right? He's still fighting who he is, right? He's being rude to Sammy. He's being aggressive with Tick in the hallway, even as he's being revealed to be gay. And that's why I think he's only half naked. He's only shirtless. Like, he's naked from the waist up, right? But Hip is completely naked as the day she was born, sitting there in this new dimension, this new world, and then meets God. And she struggles a little bit, she bangs on the door and is like, what's God, but eventually she almost like laughs herself into, like, what the fuck, she's just like, what are you talking about? And God says, name yourself, like, this I am creature, this I am being, the great I am. All the Christian references are here, but like, and I think this also made me think back to Josephine, and why Josephine is almost like the portal, the doorway to me. And I think in our communities, Josephine Baker is like the patron saint of being your damn self, your authentic self, right? And in that same vein of like what China was talking about, her being a siren, like the siren calls the men, calls the sailors and the seafarers to their deaths, right? But on the other side of death is rebirth, right? Like if we go into this ocean, right, even Hip seems like she's going into like this watery kind of thing, and many indigenous beliefs, water is almost like a portal to other worlds, right? So she's going naked into this new version of herself after being called by our siren Josephine, right, into this new version. And so we see that Josephine tried to call Montrose, right, because her song was in that space too, but he didn't listen to the call. He didn't heed the call. But Hip does, and so I think the rest of the episode is really seeing Hip get naked in all these other ways, right? She's really stripping down and delving into the condition of her heart, the condition of like her mind, and really accepting how brilliant she is, the condition of her bravery, you know, her soul. Like she's got the heart of a lion or a lioness, right? And so she's got to kind of come to terms with all of those things as a part of this rebirth. But it's important that she starts out naked in this. You got to be stripped away of all of the trappings of the little woman that you were, right, in order to be the big woman, the big entity that you really are.
Mm-hmm. And Justin, what religious reference do you see here with this?
Oh, well, besides the name Beyoncé, which, no, not the same Beyoncé, when you look at the character's name, it's Seraphine. So when you look in the scriptures, along with Seraphine is Seraphim. So Seraphim is a higher level angel. Not exactly the archangels, but just a higher celestial level of the angels that stand by the throne of God. They have 6 wings instead of the regular 2. And in one of the scriptures, it says how the wings covered his face and covered his body and then covered his feet. So there's that part right there.
So, and then Pam, please address the name of our
single ladies, right? So they have cleverly named her Beyond and Say. Well, if you're not someone who reads French, you know it's Say, and you do not pronounce the EST necessarily. The French have a very strong, tight grip on how their language is pronounced. They have an entire academy and council responsible for it. So whoever the writer is who put this together wanted to force everyone to say Beyonce's name over and over and over again. Can I tell you, I enjoy brilliance like that. So here's to Beyonce.
So from Beyonce, we get full blown into time and space. Pam, talk a little bit about that. Like, how did they connect time and space and identity for Hip?
So you see Hip really struggling inside this room, as Yelly says, to be stripped, because she's counting on and relying on everything she's learned from her dad, from growing up in astronomy, everything that she can possibly pull on. You can see she's just trying to pull it out of, as they say, pull it out of your ass. So at one point she is banging against the wall and she's like, okay, Gustav May. So she thinks about what he said about gravity. And basically his theory was about that the stronger the gravitational pull, that means that time goes slower. And so this little piece of information about time and how it slows down based upon gravitational pull, and how she realized in the room how she felt when she was standing on the planet before those 2 entities came to get her. And she talks about, okay, I felt a little lighter, especially my tendons. She mentions her tendons. This is how deep she's going to figure out how to get out of this room. And the little bits of information that she throws to herself to reassure her of everything that she knows can be that one crutch that she has. But really, when God comes in and says, first of all, you're not in a prison, okay? Let's get that straight. So you got to free your mind and the rest will follow. Literally, that is what happened to her. And so the gravitational issue and just these little bits of things that she's learned in her one world, which we eventually learn she's going to hit all of her different worlds that will matter and change to her. I think that's very important, how we rely on what we know, but usually the script gets thrown out when we talk about something like this. So, yeah.
And Also with the gravitational pull, you see that with the moon, the way it controls the tide of the ocean, high tide and low tide, the gravitational pull.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a difference between knowing and being too. Like she's been relying on knowing, and God is like, be, right? I am. So beyond say meaning it is, right? You've been reaching externally for all this stuff outside of you, right? You calculating, right? Like you looking at your tendons, you thinking about gravity, and none of that is going to serve you in here. You just got to be it. I am, right? God is like, I am. Follow my lead. I am. You are, right? Who are you, right? So going beyond it over there outside of me, and really like she had to go inside to get out of the place she thought was a prison. It's so beautiful. Oh my gosh.
But wasn't it actually a prison? Her whole life basically was indeed a prison, and she didn't want to let it go. How crazy is that? Now, Stockholm syndrome. Now we're bringing all the theories in here, but the reality is that we like what we know. The devil we know versus the devil we don't know. What she learned is it's the God we don't know, right? Because there's been this separation for however many years between us and God. So I don't want to preach just yet, but
go on and preach.
I had to hold up, because we got so much to talk about.
You know what? And I'm going to piggyback on what you just said, Pam, about that disconnect, because this reminded me of Adam and Eve. And it reminded me of that origin and that moment of, and then I connected it back to our physics lesson. So I played around a little bit with the idea of atom, A-D-A-M, and atom, A-T-O-M, and the notion of splitting atoms. So when you split an atom, energy is released. That is when, that's like a nuclear bomb is from splitting, that is caused from splitting one atom, an entire bomb. So the idea of splitting Adam, the man Adam, he was essentially, Eve pulled from Adam, he was split into two. And now you have two entities that are creating and multiplying in the same way that atoms create a chain reaction. Nuclear fission is what it's called. It creates a chain reaction, and that is the bomb, essentially. So Adam, when he was separated into two and became Adam and Eve, these two multiplied and created all of mankind. So I thought that I kind of liked that idea, the Adam and Adam. So that was my little, that was me piggybacking on your sermon, Pam.
But listen, you gave me an opening for what I thought about earlier today about the confrontation between Tick and Samuel for the first time back in episode 2. So Tick is listening to him expound upon this painting, and Tick with an attitude says, "Oh, so you're God in this Garden of Eden?" And Samuel, as any white male would do, says, "No, I'm Adam." And I looked at the screen and I said, he says, "I am Adam." White males already are ready to define themselves off the bat. Yet they have worked hundreds of years through colonization to separate people of color from being able to make that determination of who I am. Samuel had the effrontery to say, "I am Adam." Who in the world does that except white males? And the fact that Tick barely blinked an eye to question him talks about where we are as people of color when someone white declares who they are. And we don't ourselves say who I am. The question does not occur to us because it has already been defined for us. And so going back to episode 2, it made me think, oh my God, the white male has always said who he is and has told you your place in the same sentence. You belong to a lower class, you are a slave. And we've ridden with those scripts. We have ridden with those scripts and we've kept them playing. For those of us that are quote unquote woke, as woke as you are, I bet you're still playing some script that you still got to keep pushing away about who you are. And so the fact that we come to episode 7 and Hip, as a Black woman who probably falls on the bottom of the totem pole and gets asked, well, who are you? Tell me who I am. It does not dawn on her. She fights it and fights it, not like the white male who tells you who he is. And let me tell you, the reason why Samuel failed is because he refused to tribe up with his other lodges who had the information about the multi-universes. That's your first mistake. Black folks tend to live in familial areas. And I know Yelly can jump in and do her fact-based stuff with me on this about how we commune information when given the opportunity to survive. Samuel didn't feel that he needed anyone to survive. He was on his way when he really needed Hiram's information about multi-universes, because guess what? There's probably more than one Adam. ATOM, ADAM, I'm gonna let you move on to the next section because I'm giving too much.
So we're gonna move on. I felt like Damon Wayans was gonna come through with a message, like throw his bag at us. So we're now in Paris because Hip is starting to get hip to what she needs to do, and she says, I want to be in Paris dancing with Josephine. So now here she is in Paris, and she has these eye-opening moments and this monologue that was so powerful. This monologue gave us lynched without a noose. Like this was that whole segment. Pam, explain to us the 20s and the 30s and women's lib and what was going on at the time.
So in the 20s and 30s, right following World War I, which would have ended in 1918, you get women moving from this heavy long dress period, and hemlines go all the way up to slightly below your knee, which is, to see a woman's leg back then was a bit of fascination, believe it or not. We have since moved on to other body parts, but during that time, to see a little bit of knee, that was risque. And so there was this whole liberation happening. And listen, the bra had not been formally invented during this time. And so if you've ever looked at flapper dresses, there's this exposure on the side, and women were just letting it, quote unquote, as the 60s say, letting it all hang out. And this scared a lot of women who had propriety, you know. This time you got bathtub gin, you got all of this stuff happening where they want to suppress, you know, drinking and all the evils that will lead women astray. So you've got this kind of tug of war. But you find that Josephine Baker, who goes on her first tour, I think in 1925, to Paris, she finds freedom. She finds she can be whoever she wants to be, and she's not held to whatever America decides a Negro is. And you'll see them talk about, I was the definition of what you told me a Negro is, as Hip says too in her conversation with Josephine. And so this was a time of liberation for lots of women, mostly white women. But if you were fortunate enough to escape to Europe, you could be all that you could be. And so this is a very interesting time when you can say who I am and define yourself for the first time without having a man to help you define who you are.
Mm-hmm. Yelly, your thoughts?
Okay. Hi. I love this period. I love the fact that they referenced Paris. I love the portrayal of Josephine Baker. And I mean, Pamela ran it down in terms of what was kind of happening with some women at this time. Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin. So the concept of liberation through the body, and kind of going back to this notion of Josephine Baker as almost like the patron saint of pleasure and of freedom, and kind of just existing within the body is so important. Bodies in motion. if you notice, like, you know, Hip didn't even really know how to dance for real. You know, she had to kind of like just practice that little Charleston looking two-step thing. And she went from being a conservative dressed, you know, mother of the 50s to wearing a feather bra, you know, and pearls in front of an audience full of people. And wasn't as horrified as you would expect her to be by that experience and just being thrown into that experience. Like, she was ready for that. And I think that's also interesting, but again, it's under the guidance of this patron saint, Josephine. And I think it's also important to understand, like, one of the keys to accessing the divine feminine, and this is so important because this is like something that we're being taught that is super important for us to think about right now in 2020, is doing this spiritual awakening through the body, like getting into our bodies and being okay with that. Like, when we think about African tradition, even if we're thinking about ecstatic worship within the Christian tradition, you know, like, you experience that connection to God or the God within you through your body, through movement. And Paris did allow African Americans to experience this type of physical freedom that they couldn't enjoy back home. But let's be really, really honest about some other things. Like, there's a quote we should not miss that Josephine Baker has. She says this to Hip. She says, "Me, I feel like the stars in the black of space, magnificent, ancient, and already extinguished." Right? The fact that they end this first performance topless, right? And you know, this is a part of the ways in which Josephine did experience freedom and did her best to create and capitalize on the freedoms of being a Black American in Paris. But she never escaped the white male gaze. It was just a French one. It was different. They were sexualized in a different way than they are in the United States. Black women in the United States were being raped. Their men were being lynched, right? And Black women's response to that was to cover up and be respectable, right? Like Hippolyta was being. When Josephine Baker goes to Paris in 1925, she tries to powder herself down and look whiter. And the French are like, no, take that off. We want you to be darker, more exotic. They wanted the opposite type of Black woman. They wanted the sensual, animalistic jungle woman from her. That's why she was always in feathers and banana skirts. And she took advantage of that. Now, she made the most of that, but there was still that. So that extinguished star, that already extinguished star, I feel like that was those moments where she was really meditating or musing around the fact that, you know, there is a modicum of freedom, but you know, it's not everything. She's a doorway. You know what I mean? She's a model or an entry point, but we see Hip goes even beyond that. She goes beyond Josephine, right? Another thing to point out, and this is just for everybody's edification maybe, but you know, if we have to remember that this is Hippolyta's imaginings. She's had a love affair with Josephine Baker since before she got there. But you know, there's some blind spots because Paris was not perfect for all Black people. If you were from Senegal and you were one of the colonized subjects of France, you would be France's niggers. So those Africans wouldn't have been in that club. They wouldn't have been serving drinks. They wouldn't have been dancing on stage. The continental Africans that were at that moment being colonized by the French. So every European power in this world, in the Western world, has its niggers. And so the African-American relationship to Paris or to France is different from the continental African relationship with France. And so, and that's still going on today. You know, Black folks thought of France as an escape, right? But that's also why some Africans immigrate here, looking for an escape from these colonial realities. And so, so it's not all good. And I think that's really important. And that's why Hip had to keep going. Like, she had to keep going past that moment. So yeah.
Wow. And this is also where we see Frida. Mm-hmm. So we have Frida and Josephine involved in Hip's liberation and in her awakening, which, I mean, Frida Kahlo is her own powerhouse, and the two of them together and their whole background, and it's a lot. I'm gonna add something in the comments about that later. So moving on, Hippolyta gets in touch with her fierce side, and she is landed in the Dahomey Amazon kingdom, where she is training and she is getting her feet, getting her fighting legs. Yeli, I believe you're the only one that could really help illustrate what we were looking at, what's going on.
Yes, I like this too. So one of my primary areas of research is on African women's warrior traditions, and the role of spirituality and spiritual culture in addition to African militaristic culture. So these Amazons are really like a huge feature in kind of what I like to study. And this scene is like a mashup of things. It's again, this is the worlds that Hippolyta chooses to visit, the other worlds that she almost, the question is like, is she creating these worlds, right? So this is a mashup of kind of the Greek origins of the name Hippolyta, who's the Greek queen of the Amazons, and then a reference back to the Ahosi or the Mino, which are the name for the warrior women, the warrior class of women in the kingdom of Dahomey. And so that's why you have kind of almost like this Greco-Roman kind of North African kind of gold helmet, but they've mixed several different African and other indigenous looks into the scene, but it's just they're warrior women, right? And one of the things that's really important to know, even though we've got this really powerful speech being made by Nawi, which connects back to the concept of shrinking women, right? That's where she begins. She's picking up right in the middle of Hippolyta's consciousness about being shrunken by society and how these women are taught to be good wives, but she's actually drawing a comparison between being a wife and being a slave, like a well-kept slave. These little girls, though, in this history, if we're thinking about the Dahomey and the Mino, these women were chosen from age 7. These were girls who lived in society where they weren't all pushed into being a housewife. If they saw a little girl with certain skills and gifts and tendencies, they were like, oh, she needs training. And they allowed that girl, forced that girl to really fully cultivate those qualities in herself that other people would associate with masculinity. But those girls were given free reign to be as violent and aggressive as they could be in service of the kingdom. But again, that's another form of restriction. So these girls were technically wives of the king. These women were considered wives of the king, but they didn't have the same rights or freedoms or protections as other wives of the king. These women were celibate. They were virgins. They were just killing machines. They were considered to be more fierce than the men. And so when we see this group of men that are kind of like advancing on them at first, because it was supposed to be Africa, if you look at like the architecture and the landscape, I'm like, okay, this is Africa, but like, are these Boers? Are these like, German colonizers? Or who are these men? And you get them up close and you're like, oh, these are Confederate soldiers in the middle of Africa. So again, it's the mashup, so I had to kind of let go of some of my ideas about cultural continuity and which African societies, what cloth are they wearing? Because that's not the right one. And, I had a lot of that going on. But then when I saw the Confederate soldiers, I was like, oh, this is just all over the place. This is great though, because if I were Hippolyta, I would be like, my enemy are these Confederate soldiers. The main one that you see her with this ridiculously crazy, like this throat slitting death kill. She takes out Nathan B. Forrest, right? I guess that's the general idea, that he looks strikingly like Nathan B. Forrest, who was a general in the Confederate Army. And Nathan B. Forrest also eventually, shortly thereafter, after the Civil War, becomes the first Grand Dragon of the KKK. And so in her mind, this has got to be like the ultimate revenge. So not only do you have the Tulsa massacre, but during the Civil War, you have the massacre at Fort Pillow, which is a horrible moment that is led by General Nathan B. Forrest. He leads a group of Confederate soldiers to Fort Pillow, which is a Union encampment. And even though there's Black soldiers, white soldiers in the Union Army at this time, but many of the Black soldiers have their wives and children with them because they ran away to serve in the Union Army. They ran away from slavery to serve in the Army and fight for their freedom. So these Confederates, Nathan B. Forrest had his soldiers kill everybody, men, women, children, civilians, even though they came out of their encampment, they came out of the barracks waving the white flag of surrender, he had them killed anyway, because there's this policy of no quarter for Black soldiers. They don't keep them, they don't lock them up and torture them for information, just kill them. So this is almost like revenge for all of that. Like she's, you know, and also the Mino, in order to become one of these Amazon women, you have to take a head. So her cutting off his head is like a part of that tradition. Like, and I think China, you noticed that there were like skulls and heads around the like little circle where they began. So this is kind of like this scene of like ultimate take back, get back, you know, but this is also her challenging this notion of femininity and what it's supposed to look like. Femininity has fangs, femininity has teeth in it, femininity can be as violent and aggressive, and that is a form of love. Like fighting in the name of justice and fighting for your people can be a form of love that women should be allowed to wield in the world. So there's so much in here. And I think the Amazon woman itself is like a very important archetype. And I love the fact that these writers deal heavily in archetypes, which allows each of us from all of our different cultural backgrounds to see ourselves in the stories, right? So it's just brilliant.
You know, and I love this. It's a little thing, but I love that she just fought one war. You know, there were like millions more of them coming, but when they looked around and saw that they hadn't lost a single woman and they had all been slain, it was almost like she just needed to know that she could. You know, like, I don't need to fight to the last head. I know that I can do this now. Now I can go and resolve being George's wife. And then she like osmosis out. But I love that she just had to get that part sorted. You know, like, yes, I'm a mother. Yes, I'm a wife. Yes, but I need to know that I'm strong enough for this too. Like, I can fight. I have a lot of fight, actually. I can train. I can get knocked down. I can get back up. I can actually hold my own here. Now I can go and deal with the bigger issue, which was the suppression of all this in the first place. That's into right. The box of, I'm a wife. Like, that's it. Like, I'm right here. So from here, we see this tender moment. Everyone's relieved to see George again. And Hippolyta goes from being embraced to putting some distance to really just kind of let him know, like, why? Like, you knew all of these things. Like Eli was saying in the beginning, like, you knew all of these things. This is the reason why you loved me. Why wouldn't you, you know, encourage me to be as big as I can be? And they have this moment. And from here, they resolve. George apologizes. He sees the hurt that he obviously didn't intentionally do. I feel like it was more of an overlook. You know, it was in the same way somebody in our group mentioned, he's a husband in the 1950s. He's out here writing the Green Book. They shattered his knees. He's putting his life in danger. Why wouldn't he want to protect his wife? Like, we understand that. She still has thorns. You know what I mean? She's still a beautiful flower with thorns. She had this. She had it in this universe. You know, we see this. So I love that they were able to resolve that. And from that, now they were able to take a new journey. And in this new journey, this is the first time we see Hip transported in a vehicle in all of her transportings. And this vehicle looks oddly reminiscent of Woody, which is sweet. And here they are in the field, just collecting little whatever she was doing. And overdubbed is Sun Ra. And it was just a welcomed little Afro-futuristic piece of candy on top of this beautiful, whimsical scene. China, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, what I loved most, I think, about this journey that we see Hip go through is that the stages of unpacking are so well developed. And I noticed immediately that Hip began to stop doubting herself. You know, with the orrery, she apologizes, and when she's laying on the bed and she just can't figure out. And I think in a sense she's apologizing to George, like, I'm sorry I let you down in figuring out what happened. I just can't do this until she does, right? And so in the White Room, when she's talking out her theories of gravity and she's getting frustrated, and then she figures that out too. So I think there's this beautiful arc that takes her from, these moments into Paris, where she accesses her femininity and her sexuality, and, getting in sync with her body and even body image, to the anger that's been lurking under the surface that she's never been able to name until now. And I think of when Hip and Montrose are in the bookstore and Hip yells, I don't know. I don't know what it is, but it's something. And now that she can actually name this wall and this blockage, in her life, only then can she even speak to George with a clear and concise mind. So once she's with the Dahomey and she's getting all this anger out, which we don't really do. I mean, I think about when we get angry and we want to just throw something. We don't just throw something. Like, you can't just do whatever you want to do. But having that experience of taking heads and really getting frustrated and getting knocked down and fighting through that, for her to have that experience was beautiful as well. And so I also love that we move through these things, in life, and the things that hinder us, and breaking them down and healing. And so that we can acknowledge these things and still move forward into something better. I like that they really showed that. So that scene with Hip bringing George along and introducing him to her world was such a great direction to go in. He's over here taking notes and studying these plants and the science of it all. And so for Hip to be able to say, I am all of these things and more, George's wife still very much being a part of me, like, I see that I have room for all of it now. Mm-hmm. That was just like, okay, this is the best episode, like, hands down.
Yeah. Yeli on Sun Ra.
Oh yeah, I love this. I love anything Afrofuturist, and I feel like it's really important for us to focus on Sun Ra's statement about Black folks being a myth. I think the first time you read it, or the first time you hear it, you could kind of read it as a way of talking about our erasure, right? Going back to what was being said about, I think Pamela was pointing out, like, you're a slave, you're a Black person, you're a lower class person, like the power of naming that various oppressors have had, to name a thing and then define that thing. But there's something about being a myth, like a creation or a concept that someone creates, that almost could be freeing at the same time, right? He says in this excerpt from the Sun Ra piece, he says that Black people have no power in this world, right? No recognized form of power. But if you are a myth, and if you are not in this real world, right, in this reality, it almost frees you up to be a part of any reality you choose, any other reality. You don't have to be anchored to this place in the same way. And so Sun Ra, and in his statement here, but also in his career as an artist and as an educator, you should check on the internet for like his syllabus, that like for courses that he's had his students read. I mean, just the mind-bending, mind-opening things he had his classes read. He's really trying to urge his students and all of us to think of ourselves outside of colonial constructs, outside of geographies that have been structured for us, and outside of time, right? Like, Afrofuturism is really about, like, what is Blackness in the future? What do futures look like for people of African descent? What is our relationship to technology in the future? Where is the place of spirit in this future? How do we self-define it? Myths are created by a people to speak to who they are, talk about their value system. You tell these myths to the new generation so you can teach the younger folks who they are. But Black people then could become the authors of our own stories. If we are myths, we can make our own. We can revise the story. We can make the meaning fit our needs. And that's what Hip is doing. You know, if she's a myth, she is this Black woman, respectable Negro lady. And God has now told her, like, tell us who you are, write your story, tell us where you want to be, how you want to be. And she then leaves all these historical references. She leaves behind Josephine. She leaves behind Dahomey and Paris, and becomes Orinthia Blue. She just decides, like, this, I want blue hair and to be in some planet that nobody has ever imagined except my daughter D. Like, this is what the power of a myth can be if we subvert the erasure and take that as an opportunity to fill the void with whatever we want to be in there. I think it's super important, especially in light of, I think what the one of the writers of this episode said is, like, Afro-pessimism is almost the response to Afro-pessimism, right? In the previous scene, when she's in Dahomey, after they have the successful kill of all of the first round of white soldiers, then there's the onslaught, because white supremacy and white terror is not going to stop. White, you know, patriarchy and the shrinking of women, that's not going to stop, right? Even George, as good as his intentions were, he did the best he could. He did what husband was for him. Like, someone defined that for him, what a husband does. He protects his wife, he puts the fence around her. And you know, so it's like, is it a prison or is it protection? Is it protection or a prison? But his heart was in the right place, and he finally was able to act on that. And I think that Sun Ra is so appropriate, because he's like, yes, when we get outside of concept of wife and husband, when we get outside of, like, this fearful attempt to protect each other that really ends up being imprisonment, then we can frolic together wherever we want to be. You know, we just have to kind of take ownership of our story and then go there. And we may have to fight, you know what I mean? It's gonna be a fight. We have to do some of that, but it's possible, and we can do it together. We can go there together. I loved how they resolved that, and Sun Ra was so appropriate.
And there's a few artists that are, nobody is quite like Sun Ra, but there are a few artists in the category or the vein. Kamasi Washington is one, Esperanza Spalding, the Heliocentrics, a Morgan Craft, Hypnotic Brass Ensemble, and although more contemporary, I would say Janelle Monáe, because she's very much Afro-futuristic. So we're going to pose some final questions, and we're just going to leave these open for the group to explore. You can explore these in the comments. There are a few smaller themes that we didn't want to touch on because we want this to not be another TED Talk, but a few final questions. What does it mean? And I'm guessing we heard from the podcast that Hip chose herself in the end. In the end, she said, well, what about Diana? And then she just kept floating. She made no actual moves towards making it back to Earth. So what does it mean that Hip chose herself in the end? She said, what about Diana? Continued to float on. She prioritized Hip's world, essentially. And that does not mean that Diana isn't a part of it. And I don't think that means that she won't make it back. But I feel like, what is Diana, like 12, 13? For at least 13 years, it has not been about Hip. It's been about the Green Book. It's been about her wifely duties. And I think that I wonder what we would say about the fact that Hip is making it about Hip for a little while. Another question, what does Tick coming back with a book called Lovecraft Country written by George mean? Like, that was just, that quick little glimpse was a lot. I mean, I couldn't even wrap my head around that. I was wondering if that means that maybe in a timeline, because we still don't know where Tick went, maybe in a timeline, Tick ended up in a dimension where George survived the mansion and went on to write a book. And what does George writing a book called Lovecraft Country, what is that even about? What, is Lovecraft Country his Green Book instead? Like, just questions. And also, this is my favorite of the questions. ELE posed this one. What would Titus's journey have been in exploring, in going through the portal? What God character would Titus have seen? Would he have seen a big, beautiful, black android woman with a fro fit for the gods? Is that why he was so mad that Leti was in his house? Like, what does that mean? What did that journey mean for Titus going through? And other such questions. Are there any other questions that we'd like to throw at the comment section?
I know there was a theory with Tick bringing back that book that I saw a theory floating around that it was a timeline where Tulsa didn't happen. And therefore, since George and Dora grew up together, they kind of, maybe he wrote that book and moved the Book of Names into Lovecraft country or something of that nature. There were a few theories floating around about, you know, what if that book that he brought back is the Book of Names, just in a different form. But I thought it was interesting that he brought something physical back. And so it reintroduces that question of, are these journeys in the mind or are they physically, you know, like physical journeys? Because Hip did say it felt so real though, you know, much like dreams kind of do. So it's an interesting thought.
Last thoughts?
I am thinking that the Book of Names actually contains everyone's name of who you really are. That's my bet.
Okay.
That's amazing. Literal names, like all of it. And my only question was, did Tick also see God when he went through the portal? Is it possible that, to an earlier point, Taylor, you made about Hip choosing to stay out in the multiverse as opposed to going home to D, like maybe once God told her she didn't need those arm devices anymore and she could just move freely, she was like, I've got all the time in the universe to go be with D. I could pick up right where I left off because I can move through time and space that way, you know, and dimensions that way. So I feel like she didn't have to make a choice in that moment because she has all the moments. So that's kind of how I read that situation. But yeah, I mean, since Tick and Titus and maybe possibly Hiram, all of them went through, like that is a huge question for me. Like, did they all see the same big Afro deity or what? And or does, I think Justin, didn't you say, like, kind of raise the point that God might just look like you know, so each of them may have seen something different?
Yeah, your perception of what God is appears before you.
I like that because that was deep. I don't know who said it. Somebody said it, but they were like, is that why he was so mad at Leti in his house?
That was me. He was like, he got to heaven or whatever it is, realized it was a black woman, that's God, and he goes down to Ghost to spend his normal days at the house, and look, a black woman has bought his house. That's it. I've had enough. You know, he just loses his shit. Poor Hiram.
I had another theory.
Okay.
Taylor, I have another theory.
Okay.
When Atticus comes back and he has the Lovecraft book and it's written by George, you know, H.P. Lovecraft was a racist. So what if Atticus went to another universe within the multiverse where it was like White Man's Burden, if you remember that movie? It's a role reversal where we are the ones who are on the top and the others are on the bottom. And that's why the book was written by George rather than H.P. Lovecraft, who was a racist.
Or Matt, who actually wore Lovecraft Country,
Right. But it's topsy-turvy in that universe, like White Man's Burden, that movie with Harry Belafonte.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, why not? That's why I was throwing such crazy theories out in the group. I'm like, why not? We're literally in other dimensions now. You could just throw it out there. I mean, that's amazing.
Okay, I have something to throw out as well, since we throwing stuff around the room. Okay, are you guys ready for it? I noticed that when Hip was in the white room and she was completely bare, she had one thing on her still, and it was a silver ring on her right ring finger, not the left. But in every scene since then, she's completely naked, earrings off, bracelets. She has this one ring on the right ring finger in every scene until she gets to George. She has both. She has the wedding ring, and then she has this other ring that she's had this whole time. So I looked up a couple things, and it said that some women also choose to wear eternity rings on their right ring finger. And rings worn on the right ring finger symbolize relationships, self-relationships, creativity, beauty, romance. I figured there had to be some type of reason, because the right hand ring is simply just a celebration of you. That's literally what I had researched, because I was like, why is this ring showing up? Especially when she's naked, she starts off with this ring on this journey. And so
I wonder if that's connected to Tick having a ring and the Sons of Adam having a ring too.
I thought about that too. I'm like, oh, this is that was his ring into his birthright. And now this is Hip's ring in her journey to self.
As a daughter
Go
of
back
Adam.
and look at it. It's really interesting. I literally skipped through and I was like, she has this ring on and it's on the right ring finger. I just thought it was really interesting. But that's the symbolism of that right hand ring.
Wow.
Something I'm all over in the group.
What were you saying, Justin?
Nope.
No, the ring on her hand as a daughter of Adam. You got one group.
Yeah, maybe she's the only one.
Okay.
Maybe she's the only one who gets to see God because she's like a daughter of Adam. Yeah.
Or a daughter of Eve. I think we're conditioned to go straight to Adam. But as we can see through 7 episodes, it's just women pushing this forward.
Or are there like 2 lineages here, like 2 competing or parallel lineages going on?
Maybe
oh my gosh.
Because the concept of Ruby's family being so important is what Christina was talking about in the beginning. She said the whole truth has to do with the Sons of Adam and your family.
So then, okay, I'm gonna run with what Justin said, because Tick is the only one that's come back so far. So if something happened, if some sort of butterfly effect thing happened, and now everything is topsy-turvy and Tick comes back, that could change the trajectory of like everything. You know what I mean? He is the only person that has returned with a physical representation of something that is not from our timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wonder what because the preview for the next episode looks absolutely ridiculous. It looks absolutely ridiculous. There is no Hip. There is Dee. There's a little devil child on a bike. She's missing half her face. There is too much happening that I cannot explain. And I hope it has nothing to do with this book or whatever Tick did going in these other I hope he didn't touch anything. I hope he didn't move anything. I hope he didn't step on a bug, because any one of those things could throw off the next 3 episodes. That's just immediately what I thought. So we won't know till next week. Thank you for joining us. Please leave.
You know what I'm gonna say, the thing that I haven't had a chance to say, which is everything is happening concurrently, right? Past, present, and future. And we touched on for a second about deja vu, how you feel that you've been here. I'm doing everything I should be doing right now at this second, that whole deja vu thing. I think that because all of these things are happening concurrently and our tiny brains are not accessing all the capacity that we have to say in that deja vu moment, hold on a sec, let me just lean in here. Has anyone ever really tried to just lean into that deja vu moment and say, I need to stick right here to see what happens? Mm-hmm. We immediately go back to what is familiar, the here and now. So I'm saying to you that even if you move through and bring something back, I don't really think it changes what has to happen. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's a disturbance in the timeline necessarily, because whatever, I'm going crazy, whatever Tick's doing, it's his world. Mm. It's his world. Mm-hmm. And maybe this is just one segment that we're seeing. So I'm just saying, everything's happening at the exact same time.
And another thing I'm going to throw in the questions is, does whatever happened in this dimensional timeline have any bearing on whatever flew by the window when Hip was in the garage with the music cue? I don't remember what episode that was, but it was Hip and Montrose in the garage. They positioned Hip way over to the right side. This whole window is open. Something flies by the window that's child-sized, runs by the window really quickly. There's a little music cue. Some people think it might be a young Atticus. Some people think it's a young Montrose. They think it's D. They think, you know what I mean? So I'm gonna throw that one out there as well. Like I wonder if this tied in with that little unfinished business. But anyway, thank you for joining us. It's been so much fun, always educational. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, send it to mom who wasn't paying attention like mine doesn't watch this episode. And we will see you next time. Good night.